faces here. My name's Gerard Hastings, and I'm in the middle of working on a book. I've been in the middle of this book for 3.5 years on Keith Vaughan's graphic work. What I don't want to do is call it the catalogue resume, because the minute you finish a book called a catalogue resume, somebody discovers 3 more things, so it'll be as complete as possible. But in the course of doing my research on his graphic art, I've been obviously looking at the lithographs. And the first time I saw Keith Vaughan lithograph, it was this, and it was on my 21st birthday. And the 2 collectors, Professor John Ball and Gordon Hargreaves, who were fantastic collectors of Vaughan, great scholars of his work, and friends of the artist, they gave it to me for my 21st birthday. Not this particular pool, and it set me off. Then the next one I bought was this one, and actually it is this copy, this one's mine, and so on. I knew he made 8 lithographic fine art prints, but the 8th, I didn't see a copy of it until last night. And I've been looking for this print since 1979, and it's this. And if anyone knows anything about Keith Vaughan, I doubt you've ever seen this in the flesh before. The only copies I know of it are in Australia. There's one in the Australian National Museum. There's one in the Royal College of Art, where it was probably printed. Recently, Aberystwyth University in their Vaughan archive have acquired one. I know an old lady who I've been trying to get me to sell it, get her to sell it to me for years, and she won't. And then John Constable's copy here. Now, I don't know if anyone here knows exactly what a lithograph is, but most people don't. They think they do, but they don't. What it isn't is a reproduction. A fine art lithographic print is not a reproduction of something else. It only exists in the state in which you see it. So there may be a study moving towards the print, but the final statement is the print. It can only exist in this form. And then the print edition is limited. So you won't see this underneath Vaughan's prints. Normally in the bottom left-hand corner it would tell you the edition size. So it might be 75, number 1 out of 75, 2 out of 75, 3, and so on. Vaughan didn't number any of his prints. We'll go into that in a little while. The print lithograph is made, usually, it's invented by Alois Senefender in the 1790s in France, and it's done they're made on lithographic stones, and these stones are limestone blocks, and usually about this thick. Flat surface, ground down, polished to a flat surface, and then the artist uses an oil-based medium. It might be a lithographic pencil or crayon, it might be liquid touche. So these patches of colour that you see here are applied by brush, but it's oil-based. And each colour requires a different stone. Then you register the colours together. And if you look carefully on the prints in the corners, sometimes under the margins, you can see the little crosses where the colour registration takes place. I know you can see it on the... How is it in the top,
yes,
right, top left-hand corner?
Yeah.
I like seeing that quality. It's part of the printmaking process. So, the process works on the principle that oil repels water. So, the lithographic stone would have the greasy mark of, say, the crayon, this black outline, and then the stone would be wetted, completely soaked. Then ink would be rolled across the surface of the stone and will only stick to the greasy line and be repelled by the water. Paper is put on top of it without much pressure. It can be done with the back of the hand, but there's a kind of press. And then the print has the black line on it. Another stone might have just the dark brown colour. The same piece of paper goes through again, and then this colour here. Usually the black line comes last. And then this colour. So that's a 3-colour print, 3 stones. Vaughan did not work that way. He wasn't a trained lithographer. No one in Britain was a trained lithographer unless they were working in commercial art in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. In France, they had, in the 19th century, a huge tradition of lithography with specialized ateliers and studios, technicians who would advise about overlaying one color on top of another, whether it should be on the top or the bottom, so that if you put, say, a yellow and a blue down, you would get green, but does the blue go under the yellow, and so on. The French were very adept at doing this. Picasso, Braque in the 20th century, but Toulouse-Lautrec to begin with. In Britain, in the 30s, it was mainly used in a commercial process, in a commercial way to make travel posters. Shell did the travel posters in the 30s and 40s. People like Graham Sutherland, John Piper, Edward Borden were making these fantastic and very collectible posters at the time. But the fine art print, the concept didn't exist. And as a consequence of that, dealers had no idea about numbering, for example, or an edition size, or what the difference between a proof is, or a numbered print from the edition, and so on. And when Vaughan was making his prints, of course, he didn't know. So when it came to signing them, they're all over the place. This one isn't signed, this one's signed in biro, some of them are signed in pencil, and so on. In the early 1960s, an old friend of mine, Michael Ashby, I think he's still with us, he started work at the Redfern Gallery. And as the new boy, he was asked to go through all the plant chests and find all these old prints, which they bought an edition for Keith Vaughan. And he said there were piles of them, and piles like this. He spread them out on the plant chests and he asked Keith to come in to sign them. And he said, look, there's a cup of coffee, I'll be back in half an hour, you just get started. Now this is late as 1963, maybe 64. And he came back half an hour later, and to his horror, Keith with his ballpoint pen was writing artist's proof over everything. Which meant that there were no more prints, the lithographic stones, well, he didn't work on stone, we'll come to that. You couldn't make any more, so an awful lot of Keith's prints are signed, artist's proof, and not numbered. You couldn't number anything after that. So that was a bit of a disaster, but it tells you that people had no idea what these things were or what an edition was. In the 1940s, there were various organizations in Britain who wanted to democratize art. Late 1940s, for example, you know, we've had the war and there's optimism and so on. And they want people to be able to have affordable works of art. So, for example, Lyons Tea Rooms, they brought out a portfolio with 16 different prints in them to kind of vamp up their now shabby looking tea rooms and with original works of art on the walls. This proved very popular. Schools prints came out. Actually, women played a great role in introducing lithography as an artistic medium. There was Frances Bing Stamper and her sister Caroline Lucas in Lewis, and they opened the Miller's Press, I think 1941, and then after the war turned it into a viable commercial activity. And there was another woman called Brenda Rawnsley, Schools Prints. She wanted primary schools to have these marvellous prints by artists, decorating the walls, brightly coloured and so on. And then of course Prunella Clough, who was a great friend of Keith Vaughan. Prunella in 1948 bought her own lithographic press, and being adventurous and experimental, made these fantastic prints. I used to have a couple of them, and at a weak moment sold them, oh my God, with regrets. And she was a great friend of Vaughan, so she said to him, why aren't you making prints? And of course he's a friend of Robert McBride. He was sharing a house with John Minton from 1948 to 1952. And all these guys started making lithographs. The sisters from Lewis would send the artist transfer paper. They didn't know how to work on stones. And someone like Vaughan was not very good at working with other people. He'd been a designer in the 1930s, but the idea of collaboration and working with a technician was not really what Keith Vaughan was good at. He would have been quite nervous of it. So the sisters sent out these transfer papers, or Coles in East Anglia invented these plastic sheets. One side was slightly roughened to take the mark, and they were transparent. So an artist would draw, for example, if he was doing this picture, let's go back to this, the key drawing would be the black line, so he'd have that one drawn, then he could put that sheet on top of another sheet to work underneath it rather, then he could put the brown in, and then the beige, and he could register his own print at home. If you were doing this on a lithographic stone and you made a mistake, you'd have to grind down the stone, remove the ink and so on, and start again. But using plastic coal or coda trace papers, film, he could produce a quite complex print like this. And he could just get another sheet and substitute it for something else. So it was a relatively easy way of working. And for the artists who were doing this, Cahoon, McBride, Minton, Michael Ayrton, and obviously Vaughan, they didn't need much technical knowledge. They just had to draw, and they're already doing that, and brush on the tusch. They're already doing that with paint. So this in itself helped to make a kind of little flowering of all of these prints which appeared in the 40s and 50s. Why don't we talk about individual prints? His first print is this one over here, the Blue Boy, sometimes called Woodman, 1941, I think. Sorry, 1950. And he starts, I think he's pressured into making prints also by another character called, there were two brothers, the Devonish twins. One worked at the Royal College of Art as a printmaking technician, and the other one was at Central School of Art, where Keith was teaching at the time. So we've got his friends like Prunella and Cahoon saying you ought to be making prints, and then there's a technician on hand who can give him some advice. So I've got a feeling that's how the printmaking started. That particular image is a lovely image. It's quite simple in the sense that you can see it's three colours. There's the kind of golden ochre in the background, the areas of blue on the torso, the face, and then the black key drawing in the background. The title Woodman was given to it in the early 60s by, in the early 50s by Rex Nankervell, who ran the Redfern Gallery. I don't know if it's Keith's title, but who knows. But the model for it is a man called John McGuinness. And I met John McGuinness in the mid-90s at an exhibition at Agnew's, and believe me, he looked like that. He had a big, flat, broad nose, like a boxer almost, and a perfectly spherical head, and he's the same model here. And they met in 1948 or so, so about 2 or 3 years before he made that, a couple of years before he made that print, on Pagham Beach. For those of you who know about Vaughan, he was going there in the 30s, but he was still going there on and off in the after the war, in the 1940s. And he met John McGuinness. John McGuinness had been in and out of prison, worked in grocery shops, all sorts of things. And they kind of started a romantic attachment, despite the fact that Keith was involved with his partner at the time, Ramsay McClure. Never a happy union. They stayed friends until the end of his life, and Keith associated John McGuinness with, he was a very physical man, great big hands, big clumsy thumbnails, and I've got lots of photographs of him, and you can see why Keith was attracted to him. He was enormously a physical presence. And of course, for Woodman, we're talking about nature, and so on. And in the background, I don't know if you can see it, this can only be done, it can't be done on a lithographic stone, but do you see the wood grain behind the head? He's taken one of his plasticole sheets and rubbed it over wood grain, a little bit like a brass rubber, or a heraldic brass, in order to get that texture. And I think he associated McGuinness with nature and physicality, which is a very apt thing for a woodman. Whether that's Keith's title or not, I don't know. And anyway, this one, in his very earliest paintings from the 1930s, we get a tree, we get an open barn door, perhaps the sun, and in his very latest paintings, in the late 1976, he dies in 77, we get the same ingredients. Abstract images, geometrical shapes like barn doors or windows, and very simplified trees. So it's something that stayed with him, that kind of statement, throughout his life. This one. Around this time, Vaughan had been about 47, 48. He went to Brittany on a cycling holiday after the war, and he was a bit disappointed. Throughout the war, he'd been longing to get away, like all British artists. When he got there, he saw black granite walls, dolerite stone, and a very dour, harsh landscape, as he described it, and not the sunny European place he'd been looking for. But at the same time, he came into contact with the school of Paris, Braque, Picasso, and you can see that in the way the figure is now a huge figure here. The boat is flattened and tilted towards us. He's not interested in linear perspective. He's not interested in light and shade. These are very, very much flattened blocks of colour. There's this little fishing rod here. He's fumbling around with some sort of tarpaulin or whatever it is. But there's a little bit of disquiet going on in the sky. And compared to the little study that he made out of collage, this is much more energetic. It was a little laboured. This is a particular favourite of mine. It's called The Old Seaweed Hoist. And he went in 46 with John Linton to Cornwall. And they both did drawings on the beaches, and they looked at fishermen and so on. He was very interested in how the lives of the people in the landscape were affected by the landscape. They caught fish, they harvested seaweed, kelp, and various other things. And he'd seen the same thing happening in Brittany. Things start to change here, I think, with this print. You can see outlines on the figures. So essentially, these are drawings. Whereas here, we don't have any outlines, as it were. They are shapes. So the figures are flattened shapes as opposed to something with a boundary around them. So it's much more a painter's approach to doing that. A couple of years later, Edinburgh weavers, run by a man called Alistair Morton, who produced the most extraordinary fabrics. They approached Vaughan to make 6 designs for whatever, curtain material or fabrics to be used on cushions and so on, for domestic purposes. And he did this as a design, which I bought a few weeks ago on eBay, a piece of you can still pick these things up, a piece of material, and down the side of the bolt of cotton, Edinburgh weavers, their little symbol, £300. It's this big. He extends the design to here on the Edinburgh weavers fabric. But it's quite concise here, marvellous English, things coming in here, that way, sprung arcs everywhere, kind of tension to the composition. Finisterre. In the Whitechapel catalogue, which was Vaughan's in the 1960s, Vaughan's great, biggest exhibition that ever has been, retrospective. Finisterre is spelt with double R-E, and that means somewhere in Spain, a place Keith Vaughan never went to. So he didn't proofread his own catalogue because this is Finisterre in France, where he had been. So there's been a lot of confusion over this. If you look through old catalogues, it'd say, oh, he was in Spain, and he wasn't. I had a long conversation when this was given to me on my birthday with John Ball and Gordon Hargreaves, Robert Medley and Prunella Clough. They were all, the painter Robert Medley, they were all there. And we were trying to work out what's actually going on in the picture. And on the face of it, we've got a fisherman with his jumper, his gansey, and he's got his nets hanging over the side of the boat. and he's standing like that, and a bather here who's perhaps helping him. We're in a little, the tide's gone out. I don't think there's much chance of any sun coming out, but it's an image drawn from. And Gordon said, he said, no, that's not what the picture's about. The picture actually is about the relationship between the two characters. And his partner, John, said, no, don't be so silly. No, it's not. It's look. So we talked about this long and hard. And I remember Gordon saying, but look at the figure here. He's kind of doing this. Look at his feet. It's almost like a crucifixion figure, the way one foot is on the other. His head is bowed. His hand is coming up towards the more dominant figure. This is more passive character. This is more active character. And he said, John said, but look, he's folding this green tarpaulin. And Gordon said, no, he's not. That's part of the background where the hills are behind it. This went on and on all night. We talked about it. And then Gordon found a passage. They had a facsimile copy, which I now have, of his entire journals, 750,000 words, or that many boxes of paper to read through. And I've read them several times. And I've gone back to the year that he produced this print, and there's for some strange reason, the early 50s are very badly served. He didn't use his journal very often. But there's one passage in it where he says how he hates himself. He's been in France with Ramsay, they've had a row in the Tuileries Gardens, and he couldn't find in himself a way to stop dominating Ramsay. And even though Ramsay's streaked with tears, he said, I still was haughty and I was still, removed from him and everything else. And it kind of casts light, given that this is produced in the same year. But in a way, none of that matters. The image matters. But it does help, especially with Vaughan, who wrote every detail of his private life and his psychological landscape down in his journal. So an interesting thing. One more interesting thing about this is in the same year, I can't remember who it's by, a novel came out called Finisterre, and in the novel it had a gay, or as Keith would have said, a queer subject matter, in which a student has an affair with his teacher, is racked with guilt, everything goes wrong, it takes place in Finisterre, and he throws himself off the cliffs in Finisterre. Now, Keith, being a very literary character, would have known that book, especially if it had, as he would call it, a queer subject matter. He'd have found it. His circle, someone would have lent him the book, John Layman, the publisher, or whatever. But I do think that's a particularly psychologically tense image. The walled garden up there, if you just take a quick look at the figure, I say figure, there's a slip of the tongue, the tree, the felled tree. This is interesting in that in 1940, Keith's brother, Dick, was killed. He was in the RAF and he was shot down over France. And of course, Keith records all of this in his journal and so on. And then a series of sketches in his sketchbooks during the war start showing lots of felled trees. And of course, that's what he was doing during the war. He was chopping down trees. He was in the non-combatant corps, chopping down trees, clearing undergrowth, filling sandbags, digging roads, that kind of thing. And slowly but surely, throughout the sketchbooks of the early 40s, these trees start taking on human characteristics. So almost a head, or branches become limbs, which you can clearly see. And even there's like a heart inside the torso of the tree. You can see the root bowl at the bottom are almost like feet. And he associated the felled tree with fallen soldiers. And they almost have eyes on them and so on. And it was a project that didn't come to fruition, but interesting because it helps to try and explain that kind of image. He was working at the time, there was a house, an old Georgian house called Ashton Gifford, and it had been requisitioned as a school, so lots of school kids there. And that is taken from one of his 1940s drawings of Ashton Gifford House. The two gardeners talk to each other. Perhaps they've just cut the tree down, they're having a cigarette break, leaning on their spades or whatever. But again, once again, it's loaded with some sort of backstory. The Oh, let's do festival dances. Festival dances, this is made for the Festival of Britain. A portfolio of prints come out, all the artists contribute to it. This is his largest lithograph. And Vaughan was an absolute fanatic for the ballet, all the way through his life. During the 30s, actually, he even saw one of the final performances of the original Ballet Russe company. Diaghilev died, he was 17, I can't remember the year, but he was 17. 1 month later, Diaghilev died, and the original company folded and became the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo later. He never forgot this experience, and towards the end of his life, he talks about seeing the great dancers, choreographer Serge Liffard, performing and dragging himself at the end of the Prodigal Son by Prokofiev, which is never done nowadays, and his legs being cut by the rough floorboards at Covent Garden. So when he's dancing, his legs are covered in blood. And so he was crazy about the ballet. This is produced for the Coronation, artists' own experience of life in Britain. And his was the intensity of the ballet, the theatricality of it, and so on. And anyone who knows anything about Vaughan knows that the male figure is at the center of everything he does. The association of one figure with another, or the figure intertwining or interpenetrating the background, and so on. And for a long time, I thought this was just this gesture was just a decorative thing. Until a dancer friend of mine said to me, no, that means something. And to have upraised arms and then to do this movement in ballet parlance means a dance is about to start. So in The Sleeping Beauty, someone will say, why don't you dance? And that's exactly what's taking place here. Then I looked up a photograph. I looked up Serge Liffard, who he talks about a lot in his journals, remembering early ballet performances. And I went searching for biographies and pictures of Liffard, and there's a fantastic photograph of Liffard doing this. And I'm absolutely certain that Vaughan used I'm going to see if I can get rights to the photograph to put it next to the print when I eventually get around to finishing the book. So it does actually mean something. You know, this is the introduction to something, and the dance is about to commence. The final print, much celebrated but never seen bandsman, is for the Coronation, for the Queen's Coronation. And Edwin Liddell at the Royal College of Art, who ran the printmaking department, one of the Devonish brothers, thought what we'll do is we'll bring out a portfolio. It was a big portfolio. I can't quite remember how many artists took place, but every leading artist in Britain contributed to the print. Now, the mystery is all the institutions that have entire portfolios, none of them have this in it, which is a little bit baffling. I've discussed this with various people, Bob Merrick, who knows a lot about prints and so on, and Professor Alistair Crawford. Alistair says, well, maybe they didn't print all of them. You imagine if you've got 40 prints in a portfolio, and each one has to be editioned 75 times, and so on. That's a lot of printing you've got to do, and if you don't sell them, you're stuck with them. And he said, perhaps they only did a certain amount, and the rest were done to order. And so Keith may not have received many orders, and only a handful were printed. That's one theory. The other one is that his edition wasn't printed, but this might have been a trial run, and he did about half a dozen proofs, 10 proofs maybe, in order to get the colours right, the registration, in the event of the thing being, but he wasn't included in the final portfolio. So it's a complicated thing. We don't know how or why, but it's extremely rare. Now, this lithograph, if you can see, he's done his outline, he's put his colour, he uses the blank paper, which he does very often as a colour in itself. But then there's a gap up here. You can see in that gap and this gap, he's put the hand. He seems to have forgotten it here. He's not an actual printmaker. And if you think, oh, that's a one-off, the figure's legs are missing down here. He's not at all really interested in anything. This is the most decorative of all the images. I was reading something about this print the other day, and it said the drummer is distracted momentarily. Well, I don't think he is. I think he's looking at the conductor, waiting for whatever he's got to do. But it's decorative in the sense that, you know, he's used these colours and ornaments on his uniform, which corresponds to no known uniform. So he is making this up. There was one other thing, something else to mention, which I can't remember. But, yeah, that was it. When Vaughan died, John Ball and Gordon Hargreaves sorted out his studio. He went through room by room, cupboard by cupboard, drawer by drawer. And I've got John's original notebook. What he found, where he found it, how big it was, if it's signed, if it's unsigned. It's a really fine thing. And I've been through it very carefully. And they discovered 33 lithographs in total in the studio. None of them signed. So that explains why some of them are not signed as well. They didn't all go to the Redfern Gallery. But they were given 33 lithographs. They were given a collective value of, well, let's put it this way, this is 12,000. All 33 lithographs were valued at £10 collectively. Can you imagine £10? In a way, I suppose they were trying to, you know, get off death duties or something like that and undervaluing, but that's one hell of an undervalued thing. Vaughan's graphic art, by and large, has been ignored. He's partly to blame for this. In his exhibition at the Whitechapel, he didn't put any of these lithographs. He did put 3 monotypes, but they weren't even shown at the Whitechapel. An extra space was at another gallery, and he showed them there. He didn't really rate his own graphic work. He wanted to be a painter. All the way through the 1930s, he's doing colour separations and designs for advertisements, for fertilizer, for spry, crisp and dry cooking fat, for soap powder, all sorts of things. And you can still see these in the Vaughan archive at the Tate Gallery. And he hated it. And then when he started making a name for himself as a painter, around 1952, 53, which is exactly the time he was making these, he did fewer book illustrations, book covers. He took on 3 or 4 graphic art design jobs only because he needed the money afterwards. So he had a gallery in New York by this time, Zuleika Brothers. He had a big one-man show in London. So he didn't really need to produce these examples of graphic art. He kind of frowned on graphic art. He thought it was merely graphic art, whereas painting was of a much higher, more intellectual, emotional state. A lot of people still think like this today, which is extraordinary in my mind. But in a sense, he doesn't help his case. But after, this is his last print, so 53, after that date, there's very few examples of graphic art at all. Just a quick word about the very first ones. This is for a series of 8, they're absolutely delicious. He was mad about the poet Arthur Rimbaud and the book, his collected poems, Une saison en enfer, or A Season in Hell. And in 1941, 2, something like that, in the barracks, he used to sit up at night, actually cadging candle stamps. You'd think, oh, so he could draw at night. No. He wanted the candle stumps from his friends so he could do wax resists. So he'd rub the wax on, then coat it with ink, and you'd get this marvellous sparkling texture. And he produced these, not those, 6 comparable images illustrating the poems. Then, by the time he came to do these in 48, 49, John Lehman, the publisher with whom he was working at the time, doing book illustrations and dust jackets, some wonderful dust jackets. John Lehman said, well, let's bring out a book of Rimbaud's poetry. And Keith said, I've already got the images. He then translates them into these intensely jewel-like, powerful, I can roll over the surface and see something new every time. And this then went into the book, which was produced, which today costs £500, £600 if you want to buy a good copy of it, but it has to have the dust jacket. You can't. Nothing's worth anything without the dust jacket, the cover on the book. So it's wonderful to see them because, in a way, that you can see they're very different. These are blocks of flat colour, very spare. These are intensely worked little. These are illustrations. If you see what I mean, to keep the eye entertained and enlivened. Whereas these are statements, I think. And so that started it all, and this one here finished it. And you would never believe they're by the same artist. He's come a long way. Much more French over here, much more from the Neo-Romantic school, and so on. I don't have anything else to say really about them. We could go on forever, but I've got a date with the Indian High Commission to get a visa at 2 o'clock, and if I'm not there on time. But does anyone here have any of Vaughan's lithographs? No? Oh, John, you've got this one, haven't you?
Yeah, that one.
That's
but why is there such a difference between this one and that one?
Is another good reason. I spoke to Stanley Jones, the master printmaker, who's now well in his 80s. I spoke to him a couple of years ago. We had a long conversation, and he said the problem was at the time there were no print technicians. There were if you were working for a factory and they were producing a poster, or they were lithography on a box, or whatever it is, wrapping paper. But there weren't fine art ateliers. And he said, especially if you did these transfers and then sent them off, you weren't even standing next to the printer saying, no, we can't have that one, we'll have this one. So very often a print at the end of a run might be very different to a print at the beginning of the run. Deposits of ink clanging up. And if it was a French atelier system, the master printer would be standing next to you saying, I don't think we should pass this, look, there's a little thing here, or there's a mark there, or these colours aren't true. And at that point they would be signed. And that never happened. It was such a kind of ad hoc situation. And incidentally, because prints weren't numbered and people didn't know about editions, this suited a lot of galleries at the time. Usually around 75 impressions were made, because number 76 brought in sales tax. And if they were printed abroad, the import tax. So if you didn't number the print, but it was signed, you could go on selling it after the edition had been finished. But that means there's no difference between a proof and print, and so on and so forth. It was a pretty terrible situation, and a lot of people capitalised on that. So that's to blame.
And which is the normal one? Which is the print one?
That's a very clean print. Mine's a bit sharper than that one, whereas that one's got better colours than my edition. This one here is slightly different. The paper's slightly older, or slightly darkened, but it depends on which piece of paper. All of these things can be rectified, by the way. A paper specialist can deal with that in an hour, and the paper will come up white and sparkling like this, if need be. So it's a very strange business. Whereas if you go to see a French print atelier, everything is controlled. The same paper, the same man prints them. The ink, enough ink is made for the entire run, and not, oh, let's mix it again, which is what the British amateurs were suffering from.
That one's on a thick printmaking paper, Somerset or Fabriano or something.
Yeah, those are the two papers you generally use. Yes, exactly.
And it's much more fragile. And,
that's right, and therefore you get sometimes foxing and the discoloration. But it is a strange thing to see them all at once. I didn't think this would ever happen because, of course, I've never seen that before. So I'm thrilled now that I'll be able to see it a lot more often. Has anybody else got anything that they want to know about or they're not clear on?
Gerard, I think. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to ask, are these from the book or were they printed?
Well, so I don't know about these. I think they probably are taken from the book, but how do I explain it? It doesn't matter whether it's from the book or a fine art print. It's an identical process. There's a set in Aberystwyth which are signed by Keith Vaughan. That makes a difference. They're signed in Biro, of course. But that's the set we all want, but you can't, it's in private hands. I've got a set with a studio stamp on it, which means they are found on the death in the studio. There is another set, when you print a book, it's printed on one large sheet and then cut up, so it might be image, text, image, text, image, text, according to where the illustrations lie, and on the back. And then it's cut up and then stitched together and so on. And So it exists in different states, but essentially they're still a limited, except less limited, editioned lithograph.
But those were original gouache.
That's right, that's what I was saying.
I had the one with-
Get out.
at the top.
Get out. It's a gorgeous thing. So you've had that for about 4 or 5 years?
Or something.
Yeah, because I remember it coming up at
Anthony
auction.
Golf.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. I've seen about 3 of them, the originals, and I've seen them in illustration, but I haven't seen all of them. But I just hope they still exist somewhere. The one bottom right is my favourite. I just hope it's there somewhere and someone's got it. But really subtle. You know, the 3 colours are kind of buff, and then black, and then this very pale blue. And they do approximate to the original gouache, don't they?
Yeah.
They're not so far.
Yeah.
So I think he had them in front of him while he did them. But it's a separate work to the gouache. There's something really wonderful when you get the original gouache. You know, I envy you that. I may get in touch with you just to get a good photograph of it for the book. Does that kind of clear things up? Yeah.
He never etched them.
Never. An interesting point. John Craxton did, Cahoon didn't, McBride didn't, Keith didn't, did Prue, I think Prue did, Prunella did. And they were trying to get away from that. They've been brought up on Graham Sutherland, Robin Tanner, all those artists do, you know, the Goldsmith School, with all, and they're great. They're wonderful, wonderful prints. Also, Alice Miller, what was her name, Alice? Illustrations, you know, of hedgerows and black and white woodcuts during the 20s and 30s. They were brought up with these things, which demanded incredible facility, time, effort, and they're this big. And that's not what they were after. And since they weren't trained in that way, those of you who know the neo-romantic, say the drawings of John Minton with pen and ink, those are kind of in emulation of those prints with all the hatchings and cross-hatchings and little sickle-shaped moon. Very dark images. But because they weren't intaglio printers, etchings, aquatints, dry points, they did do lithographs because essentially they didn't have to change their technique in order to do it, which is common sense, really. And also they wanted money. You know, these guys had to pay the rent, unless Peter Watson was paying the rent for you. Cahoon, McBride, Craxton.
And their booze bill.
And
their booze bill.
that's the truth of it, their booze bill and the damage that they caused. So I hope that helps a little anyway. You've got an understanding of what they're about. We could go into the techniques of how he did every single one and everything, but that's for geeks like me.
Gerald, I know you've got to get off, so
I do,
thank
I
you
do,
so
I do.
much.
Sorry.
Thank you everybody for joining us. It's really lovely to have you all here for our exhibition.
Thank you.
We've also got tea and cake for everybody, so you can continue
Whoa.
the conversation.
Thank
Thank you.
you.